we have work to do, and we have a great vision which is before us, and I hope that everybody will come together in the best tradition of what is
I
CWS,
can see you.
and breathe new life into that vision.
I can see me.
Yeah.
I'll be the eyes so that I just can be.
This is another episode of a special series called Enough for All of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. This series sheds light on 75 years of an NGO called CWS. My name is Maurice Bloem and I welcome you to another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. This is part 2 of a conversation I had with the President Emeritus of CWS, John McCullough. And we continue where we left off, which means listening to John's experiences and views about an organization that he led for more than 20 years. When I look at Church World Service, I think this organization started in 1946 as a US Christian organization and tried to work ecumenically. And now I think it has evolved into a global interfaith organization.
Mm-hmm.
If I say that, would you agree? And if so, why? And if you don't agree with my observation and statement, can you also explain why?
Well, I think I definitely agree that the organization has evolved from an ecumenical organization. But I think it still is very much an ecumenical organization. I think it's also interfaith, but I think it's more than that. And I think that that's part of, I think while it might not have been as transparent back in 1946 when the organization started, and because I mean basically. You're talking about shipping a lot of material resource from the U.S. Especially to Western Europe, to Italy and France, and eventually to Japan. But a lot of those goods actually came from churches. Churches did the collections, and I can even remember, when I first started my ministry of, the church halls, the fellowship hall was. The stage was always packed with clothing that was going to be shipped somewhere. So I mean, I think in those early days you really could put a much stronger ecumenical branding on the work. I think over time, CWS has become a bit more interfaith, but I think that's a later development. I don't think that really happened so much until really, frankly, the 2000s. I think is when that really began to take root, and not so much because we chose it as CWS, but as much as I think it is sort of the nature of partnerships and networking that agencies like Church World Service need to be a part of. But when I say it's really more than just ecumenical interfaith, I think that has everything to do with the Crop Hunger Walk. Because what the Crop Hunger Walk did was it created a space for not only local churches and civic organizations, but anybody, whether they chose a faith context or not, but whose values aligned around issues of hunger and poverty in particular. It gave them a space in which they could give expression to their concerns. So the history of the Crop Hunger Walkers is that it's a tremendous eclectic of a national population, and CWS has valued that. So I think when you really peel back the layers of this organization, you really see that, and you see it not only in terms of the Crop Hunger Walkers. you see it in the staffing, and it also is visible even within the context of governance now. So um, it's 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 ecumenical and interfaith, but it's also more than that.
If I would ask you to come up with a song that would, if you think about church world service and what it is about, is there a song that comes to mind? When you say, "Hey, if I listen to this song, it goes, yeah, it tells me something about this organization, or I get the same type of feeling about what we need to do or why we were established."
Yeah, I mean, one of the songs that historically has been important to me is Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On," and because I think it really sort of represents the everyday person, really taking a closer look at sort of the dynamics and seeing what seems to be wrong or what seems to be very questionable, and raising it up to say, hey, um, so that certainly is one. There's another one that came out. I don't know. Maybe it was a decade or 15 years ago. I'm not sure the timing of it. I'm just thinking about secular music and probably revealing probably my prejudice for African American music. I don't know, but Bill Withers' "Lovely Day" is another one, and because it does speak about hope. That even though, I mean, we may be living in the midst of a world that feels very chaotic and confusing at times, that there is still good out there, and so how one chooses to sort of approach that day makes a huge difference in terms of the outcome by the end of the day. So that's something that is particularly important to me. Um, yeah, I mean, there are songs of faith that I have leaned on, but I'm really more of a bar oriented person. I like music that is very calming, and doesn't try to tell me what my thoughts ought to be, doesn't put the words in my head, um, but allows me to feel my own emotions and my own sense of peace, and it's not intrusive, and it allows me to work through a thought process. Um, so that's probably not the kind of answer you were looking for, but
No, it
that's kind
does.
of where
Yeah,
I am with
yeah.
music. Music is very important. It's always been very important to me, but I like music that reaches deep into my subconscious.
Let us dig a little bit more in your subconscious, and if I would ask you, what do you like about the work of church world service?
Well, one of the things that I really, really like about Churchill Service is that this is an organization that is infused with people who actually care about the things that we do. I I honestly believe that we have very, very few uh, people in this organization that are doing this work because they just need a job. I believe that most everybody, if not in fact everybody, is here because they believe in the mission of the organization. And I think that I've felt that from the very beginning of my tenure and throughout the years. And so I think that's incredibly unique. And so I've oftentimes, have said to others that the nature of the staffing of this organization is such that if CWS were to go out of business this afternoon, um, our staff would still be doing the same kind of work. They would be finding a different place to do the same kind of work by tomorrow morning.
Mm.
And it's just because this is, I think, people here are wired that way,
Mhm.
and so I just think that's really different. So that's, to me, is a great learning and a great sense of blessing, I think,
Mm.
when it comes to relating to this organization. I like the fact that we have, for the most part, the freedom to make the decision about where we most need to be in terms of responding to human vulnerability. That I think in, you know, uh, probably many organizations of this kind, there's a very specific body of work or approach or methodology that has to be employed. And so you have to stick to that framework. Um, but this organization invites the imagination and innovation. And so new ideas can emerge from any place within the organization. And it may be introduced on a very small scale initially, but then it becomes something that can be examined more closely, and a decision can be made as to whether or not we ought to really expand upon it. To me, that's very exciting, to be in that kind of a place. It also can make it very challenging because you know um, you can end up trying to do too many things, and so you really sort of exhaust your
Mm.
resources, or you take away the focus of the organization because you're pointing in too many different directions. And so, but then we also have the ability to sort of reel things back in when we do feel like we've overextended ourselves as an organization. But CWS is able to be in a lot of different places, and it's right on time. I find that to be, again, something which is very exciting about this organization, and invigorating.
Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about the brand Church World of the brand Church World Service or CWS, John. Um, we talked a little bit about crop hunger walks and still very successful, but you know that our supporters are still more senior, and we are trying to figure out how can we attract this younger audience.
Mhm.
And as part of the you know of this, I think it's part of the 75 years of celebrating what we have done well, but also looking forward is, do we need to make certain changes? And as part of that brand exercise, we also have looked at, as you know, at a possible name change. And I would like to talk about that particular name change, um, because especially the word church seems to be, sometimes creating a challenge for us, especially with this younger audience. Now, yeah, I would like to hear from you. What's your opinion about, you know, the organization looking at the possible name change? And again, I'm not saying that we will, but just, yeah, take us a little bit through your thinking process about how you approach this in terms of, how can Church World Service continue to be effective, continue to do its mission, and should we be looking at, uh, if we need to change our name in order to continue to be effective?
Well, I mean, I think the name of an organization is certainly very important, and it I mean, it needs to be something that people really resonate with, that they're drawn to, and certainly the name Church World Service was born of an era in which um, the role of churches was very, very much in the forefront of certainly within the United States, but not just in the U.S. But if you just take the context of the U.S., it was sort of that prevailing culture of the nation. Everybody was expected to be connected, with a church or with congregational life, or religious life. That was something which was very important. And so I think, not only church world service, but you look at, Jewish world service, it would be another example of that, in which it was very important to really sort of make that statement about who you are as an organization. And so we had a natural audience that was tuned into CWS. And but over the course of now 7 decades, things have changed. And so, I'm not going to say that I totally bought into the U.S. becoming more of a secular society, because I think that there are still very strong spiritual and religious tones in the country, but they don't necessarily lend themselves effectively towards the more organized church reality. And with the emergence of the coronavirus, that I think threatens that infrastructure even more. What will unfold in the years to come remains to be seen, but I don't see us getting back to that time in which, on Sunday morning at 9 a.m., the typical American family is, all walking out the door with children in hand, all in their Easter best clothing, and going to the neighborhood church. I just don't see that becoming the reality. So it does sort of beg the question of whether or not the name Church World Service is as relevant, it is as attractive. I think it certainly is a very powerful name, but I think just as it can attract, it can cause people to decide that they don't want to be a part of it. Unless you have the opportunity to sit down with them and explain to them what it is. um, so uh, I think that for Church World Service, um, I think the opportunity is there to really sort of investigate whether or not there is an alternative that can be offered that would also be powerful for the current context. And I don't necessarily feel as though what we need to do is to say, if we're going to change the name, that we're buying that name for 75 years. Who knows how the world will change 25 years from now or 50 years from now. You may once again need to go through that exercise because where people are is in a different space. And I know, that, for as people who are traditionalists, and to a certain extent I am a traditionalist, they say, well, no, you hang on to that identity, and convince people that it still is relevant. Um, but I think that it's a worthy exercise
Mhm.
for the organization to explore other possibilities, and I think it's also a natural part of changing one's self understanding from being a U.S. based organization to the world to truly becoming a global organization. And so, if you look at the name through the lens of people outside of the U.S., do they see the same thing? And
Mhm.
I know there's some places where they definitely would say we see the same thing,
Mhm.
but I think there are other places in which they clearly would say they don't. I know of many places that I've traveled to on behalf of CWS in which uh, church isn't just as a non-starter as a
Mhm.
concept because the government doesn't allow it. It's not built into the mentality of the population at large. So whereas in other places they could never foresee anything other than something like church will service. I mean, for them that would be an imperative. So it's sort of a tricky process, but I think it's a good exercise for the organization to go through.
Mhm. Yeah, I would like to come back to the word that you use. I consider myself as a traditionalist, because that even puts a question mark for me, because I think we know each other now for 20 years, worked very closely for 11. Is that you force your colleagues to question, you know, um, at a regular basis, if what we are doing is still the right thing to do. And in that process, you ask or you demand from your colleagues and from yourself to listen really deeply or carefully
Mhm.
to people who are involved in that process. So how do you link those two? On the one hand, you're saying I consider myself as a traditionalist, and I know you as a person that is not afraid to come up with you know doing things differently, or to take a stand, or
Mhm.
um, yeah. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that?
I do believe that tradition is important. I think there you know I think a number of times in our conversation have lifted up the concept of values and principles. That there are you know th- those really sort of make up that skeletal infrastructure that really holds an organization together. It's what matter that really makes the difference, and how it is infleshed beyond that i- will always be a variable. So I think it's important to be tuned into to the traditions that have been of importance to you. So for me, again, a a faith context is part of my tradition,
Mhm.
and it doesn't mean that I buy into everything, that in my case the United Methodist Church says, but there are fundamentals there, that I hold on to, and they influence um, virtually every decision that I make.
Mm.
And so I think history matters, and so I don't believe that it's important to live in the past, but I think it's very important to understand the past. And when I was a college student, there was a little saying that I had, which was the past informs the present, which directs the future. So I think it's important to be connected with with that past, with those traditions, and to understand how they correlate to where you are in the moment, and where you think you might be heading into the future. So so to me, they're not. It's not a contradiction to speak about tradition while at the same time being innovative. Uh, I I I I believe uh, that we are called, all of us are called to be um, creatures of what I would call God's good creation. And I'm not one that would say, well, it was all made in 6 days, and on the seventh day God rested, and that was it. And everything that happens thereafter is just a simple recast of what happened in the first 6 days. No, I believe that, okay, 6 days, God rested, but then guess what? Monday rolled around, and God got back to work.
Mhm.
So, and so I think the same thing applies, in our human context, and certainly that's how I sort of see it in my own life. That I need to keep my eyes and my ears and my other senses open to how the world around me has changed, and to what I may need to respond to, and I need to understand that how I respond to those challenges today um, will necessarily be different from the way in which I would have responded to similar things in the past,
Mhm.
because my tools and my resources are simply different. I mean, when I grew up, I was sitting in front of a little black and white TV, and had what, maybe two or three channels. And now, you meet anybody on the street and you talk about television, and they say, "Oh, did you see this show? Did you see that?" Or, have you listened to this podcast? And I mean, and it's like, no, I'm an overload. There's far too much stuff, you know, that's going on. So, so I have to innovate differently, than I would have back
Mhm.
in 1955 to where we are now. It's just is different. So I think I don't think innovation and tradition um, uh, uh, necessarily contradict each other.
Mhm.
I don't think one is necessarily better than the other. I think it's just important to be connected to both, to understand that there are some things that are very fundamental to who you are as a person, to your system of beliefs, to the principles by which you stand, which govern your life, and then that's balanced uh, by an awareness that the world has in fact changed. The world of church service is very, very different today than it was in 1946.
Mhm.
And it was, I mean, it was during my tenure that we finally declared that World War II was over. It took a
Mhm.
long time for us
Mhm.
for us to finally say, okay, let's put this behind us, and let's begin to embrace what is ahead of us. But uh, the CWS of today is not the CWS of 1946. It really is a different organization, but there are some fundamentals,
Mhm.
you know, that still remain. Um, I I feel that uh, it will be important for CWS to expand the table of those who participate in this work. I think with greater intentionality, um, while membership, as an example, primarily takes the shape of church bodies. Um, uh, I hope that CWS will choose to find other entities
Mhm.
that are equally important, and create space for them at the table. Because I think the kinds of issues that um, our world face are of such a magnitude that it really is going to take um, uh, 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 quite a different construct than that which has really sort of driven this organization, over the past 74 years,
Mhm.
if you will. I do think that's going to be very, very important. I don't think that's just going to happen overnight, but I think there has to be intentionality to try to make that happen. Uh,
Mhm.
and um, and I think understanding it uh, CWS as a grassroots movement. There are a lot of brilliant young people out there, who really do care about changing the world, and we need to listen to them and invite, their participation,
Mhm.
trust their participation. It doesn't mean that we set everybody else aside, but I think we need to be very intentional about bringing them in and giving them, making sure that they have a place at the table to really help shape this work. So, I mean, for me, it goes well beyond the naming. I think that's a part of it,
Mhm.
but uh, the branding of it is probably more important because it's
Mhm.
the branding, that that's distinct from the name. It's the branding or setting of the context and the culture of the organization that's going to draw people in and keep them there. And as long as they feel as though this is a viable place in which their ideas are, and their participation is respected, and they can see the evidence of the contributions that they can and have made, um, then then their investment will be much deeper, and we need it. I think the challenges of global migration and climate change um, are really going to be enormous. And I think I mean, the enormity of them right now is frightening. But I think it's the reality is that the challenges are going to increase, not decrease. And so I think that CWS has recognized this. Um, to me, I like to think that recognition is also spirit led, and if it is, then the organization is definitely in the right place. But it needs to be patient enough. It needs to be intentional. It needs to be patient, and to see things through. It's because these are not issues that are going to be resolved overnight. Um, Everything that CWS has worked on over the course of these past 74 years, none of them have been resolved overnight.
Mhm.
Um, they all take time.
Thank you, John, for sharing that. I mean, looking definitely a vision, looking forward, which will be important for this organization. Let us look back for a bit, and can you share maybe an anecdote or an experience which best describes your time with CWS?
Well, I think probably one of the most important times for me was when I uh, went to Bosnia, and the our country director, took me through Sniper Alley, and we had a chance to talk to some people in terms of their experience of living through the Bosnian War, and
And when was this, John? Was that with Vitaly Vorona still?
yes,
Um,
yes. So that probably was maybe around maybe 2002 or 2003, right around
mhm,
that time frame, I think.
mhm.
But we went, after surveilling sort of the urban area, we drove well out into the countryside, and he took me to what had been a very small village, and largely deserted, and it was a very cold winter day. Fortunately, there was no snow on the ground, but it was extremely frigid. And So we came to this little camp, and as we were approaching, I remember seeing a U.S. Army Humvee. A couple of guys sort of sitting behind the brush, trying not to be obvious, but they were definitely there. But we went up into the villagers and met them. There was a group of about 30 people, and so they described what the war was like for them, and pointed to a valley just a little bit, maybe 1,000 feet beyond where we were standing, and a hill, a valley, and then a hill that went up the other side, and so they began to talk about how they were victimized, and when in this case the Serbian army had come in, um, they told them that their village was going to be destroyed, and but they would be given one last opportunity to flee. And so they were directed to run down into the valley and to climb that slope and to make their escape. And so that's what many of them did. And as they made their incline up the slope, the army opened fire and killed them. It was a massacre that unfolded in that space. Um, the people that I talked to were the survivors, and they had made a decision that they were not going to allow that to be the end of the story of their village. They returned to reclaim it. And so um, they felt that it was important for them to get through the winter. And so they were trying to see if there was a way that they could construct a building large enough to shield them from the weather, after which they thought they could make it. And so they asked me if it was possible to help. And um, feeling the cold that was searing through my whole body from how cold it was there. And seeing one man who was laying on a cot wrapped in a CWS blanket and knowing that surely wasn't going to be enough. Um, I heard one of them say, if we can just find some materials to build a house, that we can fit into, we can make it. And so um, my country director knew exactly what I was going to say in that moment and tried to dissuade me from saying anything, but I said it anyway. And I said, well, I think we can help. We will provide you with the materials so that you can build a house, because they said they had the skills to do it. They just didn't have the materials to work with. And so my country director said, well, we don't build houses. And I said, well, we do now. And so from there, we provided them with the resources, and they built a house to get them through the winter. And from there, they began the process of rebuilding their village. Um, uh, that was a very, very powerful moment for me, and I think for CWS, and that became the foundation for an expansion of our work in Bosnia and Bosnia Herzegovina and into Serbia, into Georgia. I mean, there's just that whole region of Eastern Europe, um, and our work with the Roma. That all of that came out of that moment, in which here was this little community that refused to allow a massacre of their compatriots to be the end of their story, and the partnership the CWS had with them that became a transforming presence and influence. Very important story.
I was also wondering that when you understand more about how CWS works around the world, um, you see that it really tries to look at the context, right? So, and as a result, in a certain region, we might do different things than in another region. Because the need is different, because of history, because of context, and people who don't know us necessarily sometimes think the initial impression is that, oh, they all do different things. That where is the the unity or something? But you need to dig deeper to see that I think, and I would like to hear your point of view there, that because of the partnership motif and the grassroots elements, that's where you see the similarities between the different interventions around the world and the collaborations. So there are certain things maybe you don't see initially when you look at it straight at all our work around the world, but you will see them when you do a little bit more digging.
CWS is an organization that has multiple cultures, and I think that's a. I mean, ultimately, I think that's a good thing. And I mean, people might think initially that if you have multiple cultures, it means that there isn't any real synergy.
but actually there is, like, as you've indicated, once you dig a little bit deeper, um, you what you find is a common base of values,
Mhm.
and that's what ties people together. So for example, I mean, in terms of the sort of the work in South America, there was the Sao Paulo process,
Mhm.
and so it called for a sort of a very different kind of mentality in which there was a consciousness of how U.S. foreign policy, uh, certainly in terms of the perception of Central and South America, uh, was very unfair and unnecessarily dominating,
Mhm.
and didn't respect the level of intellect that was resident amongst the native peoples of Central and South America, and,
Mhm.
and their ability to determine what was in their best interest. And then you sort of contrast that with Africa, that was moving through a post-colonial period in which there were lots of revolutions, if you will, and to sort of dethrone the European colonialists, and yet at the same time, as the Europeans were being sort of forced out of power in Africa, you ended up having a number of emerging dictators in Africa that uh, felt as though their the success of their new independence was predicated on self-preservation as leaders of the
Mhm.
country.
Mhm.
And so it didn't necessarily respect the people, and so you had to deal with a whole different power base in that setting. I mean, you just really sort of go from one region to the next, and you just see a lot of those differences that were at play. So um, so it's certainly a variety of cultural difference within the organization. But at the end of the day, um, the values of a commitment to human rights, to fundamental beliefs that people should have um, the opportunity to live in a stable community, to be able to become self-sufficient, and in terms of their employment, that they should have access to good quality health, that they should be able to sustain their families with good food and access to clean water, that they should be able to feel a sense of safety. I mean, all of these are basic things,
Mhm.
that regardless of what the sort of the prevailing dynamics, cultural dynamics, from one region to the next, whether it was in Asia or in southern Asia, as opposed East Asia as opposed to Southern Asia, or
Mhm.
you know, I mean, it just regardless of those factors, there were certain fundamentals, that CWS was committed to. That's what really sort of created a sense of unity. But you really had to sort of peel back a lot of layers to get
Mhm.
there,
Mhm.
to sort of see that.
A word that is used already quite a lot is justice. Um, I would like to ask you, if and rightly so, and thankfully, Black Lives Matter is very much a current issue.
Mhm.
Um, and I would like to ask you, if you think about the role of CWS in fighting injustice, and especially racial injustice, and we look at the organization in the last 75 years, how did we do as an organization? And of course, there are always things that we should have done better, and maybe some things we did well. Um, but if you look now back at 75 years, and part of those 75 years, you were part of it as well. How do you think Church World Service did? That's one part of the question. And then the other one is, what do you think Church World Service should do in the next couple of years?
Mhm. Well, I think the picture of how CWS did over its first 75 years is a very complicated picture, and I mean, I guess I would lean towards saying, if certainly if you're looking at it through the lens of the United States, I would say we didn't do a very good job at all. I think we probably CWS probably had a failing grade, and but then you have to take into consideration that in terms of CWS, in terms of its sort of the essence of the organization initially was focused on events outside of the U.S., not focused on events within. CWS didn't start as part of the larger ecumenical movement. It started off as a grassroots movement, faith-based, but it wasn't really sort of ecumenical in the sense that it was sort of controlled by the churches. Eventually, that did become its reality. And so when CWS became part of the National Council of Churches, there was a divide that was made. And so CWS was still viewed as having expertise beyond the US, and wasn't looked to as an entity that would address racial injustice in the United States as a case in point, or poverty in the US as a case in point. Its focus was really outside of the US. And the National Council of Churches created a division within its body that focused on racial justice, and I think was very effective. And unfortunately, its own history was not able to fully develop and mature, and in part because it was beginning to sort of evolve around a particular personality who unfortunately died at a very young age. And it was difficult for the organization to sort of pick that back up and really run with it. But I think, if you look at CWS in the context of being part of the National Council of Churches, you would say, well, in that sense, yes, CWS was effective, but not if you really sort of look at CWS as its own entity. And I certainly recall that when I started as the executive in CWS, I did have occasion to meet with leaders of several of the historic Black or African American churches, who expressed to me in no uncertain terms that historically they had a lot of issues with CWS, because they felt that this organization did not take a stand for racial justice. So we had to begin a process of trying to sort of correct that. It wasn't about sort of correcting a perception. It was really about looking at the ways in which CWS could, in fact, begin to address the issue of racial inequities that existed, and not only in the United States, but to look at it through the global lens, which was really sort of more of the expertise that CWS had. So it's clearly it's a very mixed picture, and I think it's, when we sort of look at the history of the organization, I think even if you look at what Ron Senning wrote in his 50 years, and then you look at what will be written about these last 25 years, you probably won't see a lot of attention focused on CWS in terms of its stance. But there certainly were times in which CWS did take a big stance, and one of them was around the burning of Black churches, and that was in sort of the within the first 4 years of the transition from beyond the 50th anniversary. I mean, that was, fortunately, the leadership at that time came up with a very creative way to make it possible for CWS to raise money that could be put into the care of African American churches to counteract the intentional burning of churches by white supremacists. So that's something that we would certainly point to as a very important moment. A second is, of course, the strong stance that CWS took with respect to the apartheid movement in South Africa. When you think about the larger personalities like Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu and others. I mean, they definitely knew church service and appreciated how strong the stance of CWS was. So it wasn't just the National Council of Churches; it was a CWS stance addressing what was racial injustice in that part of the continent of Africa. So it's sort of a mixed picture in that sense. When we're talking about the future, I think CWS has to really sink its heels into addressing the issue of racism in the United States. In many ways, I certainly found myself in many ways over the years saying that if CWS can't help to solve the problem of hunger and poverty in the United States, given all of the resources that exist within the U.S., then how could we possibly accomplish that in other countries where you don't have those resources as readily available? And so I think in many ways the same thing applies around racism. That you can't go around the world and tell people in those countries that that they are practicing racist behaviors, because racism exists all over the world. It's not a U.S. phenomenon. Racism exists all over the world. You can't go around telling everybody that that this is an injustice and you've got to solve it if you're not willing or you haven't demonstrated that you have the ability to address that in your own backyard. And as much as I, and I'm sure others, not only in this sort of moment in history, but over the course of our 75 years, have wanted to speak about CWS as a global organization. The reality is that our initial root is deep in the United States. Most of the churches that form the base of CWS or have formed the base of CWS are U.S.-based churches. And so I think there really is an imperative for the organization to really become much more involved in the issue of racism in the United States. And I think that if it does, it'll send a very important signal and to the quality of its work and its partnerships in other places in which CWS really tries to affect real transformation and change.
We came up with a racial justice platform, right? So this is definitely now one of the very important pillars of the work, and we try to mainstream that. I don't know if that's the right word within this, but to ensure whatever we do, we keep that in mind. The NGO sector also has been criticized. Yes, you have given aid out, but you did nothing to change the power structures. So you have maintained colonialism, etc. Those type of things. So where you again, my question is, if you reflect there on CWS 75 years, um, how did we do? What is the grade that you would give us in terms of how we approach this?
I'm very much aware of the fact that there is sort of a prevailing public perception of NGOs and in terms of their effectiveness around the world, and I think while people certainly would have higher expectations or hopes, I would say as a collective, I think the NGO community has made a viable contribution. I think it's limited, but I think it has made a viable contribution, and certainly um, has demonstrated effectiveness in critical areas. And oftentimes it comes down to the common denominator of an individual or an individual family. So I mean, when you're asking, how did an agency do in relationship to affecting real change? A lot of it has to do with how that individual or that family who has benefited from that help. So clearly there would be those who would say absolutely it played a profound role and changed the quality of my life in the future, for myself and for my family and maybe for my community. And then you'll find others that say, well, it was sort of okay, but it didn't necessarily reach my expectations. Um, I think there is a variable in terms of how NGOs do. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think I've learned over time is that it's difficult for NGOs to claim that you know when they say they're working with a particular community or they're working with a particular partner, to be able to say that they're the only ones working with that community or they're the only ones working with that partner. There's a lot of sharing that takes place, but there is a difference in terms of the methodologies. There are a lot of NGOs that CWS as an organization, I don't think has ever gone into any situation, uh, with the mindset that we see ourselves as being there permanently. But CWS has gone in with the mindset that says that if we have to really be involved in the situation for decades, we're prepared to do that in order to make sure that there really is change. And part of the change, which is one of the things that I think I'm very, very proud of about CWS, is that we're very intentional about the indigenization of the work. And so it's not an organization that is going to send a lot of expatriates into and sort of make that the prevailing characteristic of the organization's presence. The intent is, okay, if you go into a situation and you don't immediately identify people or an organization, local organization that can carry out the work, well, okay, then you set up an infrastructure that can do it. But in the meantime, you begin an intentional process of identifying and training local talent and putting them into positions of leadership, so that in time, that's part of the transformation that takes place. That in time, it really does become, or it feels like it's an indigenous organization. It may still carry the name CWS, but for all practical purposes, it really is an indigenous organization. And so I like to say that CWS is an intensely indigenous organization. That wherever you go around the world, you're going to see the evidence of that. And I think that's something that we can feel very, very proud of. And I think that's one of the things that really distinguishes CWS from a lot of other organizations, frankly. I can't say that I've studied all of them, but I would say that my impression is that CWS is really quite different. And so on that score, I would say CWS is probably an A grade because I think it's been very intentional, and I think we've been very, very successful at it. At the same time, when you talk about changing power structures, again, I think a number of organizations sort of go into places where there is injustice which is unfolding, and certainly want to bring aid of some sort and have an impact. But there aren't a lot of organizations that are willing to really speak truth to power. And CWS, in fact, is an organization that's willing to speak truth to power. And that can be a very scary thing to do, because if the powers that exist within a country choose to view CWS as an American organization, and then they would say, well, who are you? By what authority do you come in here and try to tell us how to conduct our business? And so I think part of the success of CWS positing itself as a more indigenous organization, its ability to partner with local organizations has given it credence to be able to speak to authorities within countries where we believe that those authorities, frankly, are part of what has created injustice within a given society. And so in this case, I think there are many contexts in which I think CWS has been incredibly effective. So you certainly, again, can look at, I mentioned, earlier in terms of the apartheid movement and CWS speaking truth to power in that situation. So I think CWS have an extraordinarily high grade in terms of how we have really worked to affect change, and I'm very proud of the work that we've done with respect to Cuba and trying to help improve relations between the Cuba and the United States. It's a very complicated issue, but getting the leaders of those countries in to talk with each other, and it doesn't mean all the problems are solved, but clearly the pendulum has moved in a positive direction, and so I think there are a variety of settings in which we have had a very, very positive impact.
Mm. Yeah, thanks for I think there was a lot to digest for the listeners, and John, what I often say in terms of the work of CWS, and I think that is important. You used words in terms of partnerships, empowerment. I always say, Church World Service tries to create choice, voice, and agency. So then you work on sustainable solutions.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that, I think, in the countries where we have worked, if we decide to go in, we are there for the long run. And then you highlighted indigenization, and that's also true. We have, I think, SSID in Dominican Republic is a good example. It was Church World Service before, is now its own organization. Like in Bangladesh, the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So we have examples, different ways of how we kind of ensured that it went beyond a couple of expats that are trying to do something. No, it is partnerships and looking at context, really trying to make a sustainable solution and a better future. So
and making hard choices. We can look at Iraq and we took a very strong position standing with Christian churches in Iraq prior to the fall of Saddam Hussein, and the U.S. and Iraq were on the verge of war. I mean, CWS, we were part of a peace effort to try to avert the war. We were not successful in terms of that, but we certainly got incredibly close to help that government to see that there could be an alternative to the way in which the dynamic between the two countries was unfolding, and then when sort of following the major part of that conflict, deciding how to be a constructive participant in the delivery of humanitarian assistance, and in ways that would not compromise our values as an organization or confuse the people that were our historic partners within Iraq. There are a lot of things in there. There are a lot of things that have unfolded over the course of our history that I think speak very, very well to CWS, and I think distinguish the organization in many ways, so that it would be unfair to sort of paint all NGOs with the same brush, because there is a difference.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it for your willingness to talk with me today. So all the best.
All right, thank you, and all the best to you and to your colleagues in CWS. I'll certainly be amongst. I'll be in the forefront of those that'll be cheering you on. So.
You know the hotline you can call if you have complaints, right?
No complaints. No complaints.
Thanks, my friend.
Hey, thanks. Bye-bye.
Do you see you? Do you see me? Will you be the eyes so that we all can be?
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram. And if you want to know more about Church World Service, please go to cwsglobal.org.